Good morning, ma'am. Thank you so much for the introduction. I think we have 59 minutes and it's a big topic, so I'm going straight into the topic. One disclaimer. So it is 60 minutes and we need to keep the session interactive. So I have a list of the participants from Anuja and Nisha, and I'll keep asking you questions on the chat box. And if you don't answer, I can pinpoint people because I know the names now. So I have the names of Dr. Sushma's candidates and Dr. Geeta and Dr. Preeti Sanghvi's candidates and Joyita's candidates. So I can just pick on anybody and ask you a question. So please participate and answer in the chat box. Okay, so our topic now today is in the context of a patient with advanced disease and palliative care needs, the approach of a patient with abdominal pain and distension. And we'll spend around 15 minutes in abdominal pain, approximately 20 minutes on obstruction, and 15 minutes on ascites. This is the topic that has been given to me. It's a very important topic. As you can see, the unexplained abdominal pain is the most frequent cause of medical visits to doctors in the US by the general population. And in cancer, the cause could be a mix of visceral pain, neuropathic pain, somatic pain. So it's an extremely important symptom for us to master. So what is the approach? It's a basic. When a patient of abdominal pain comes to you, what does one do? What is the first thing we do? I'm requesting everybody to please mute except for the administrators. So what does one do? What does one do when you see a patient who's comes to your OPD or comes to the emergency room when they tell you they have pain in the abdomen? What is the first thing you do?
So they need to answer in the chat box or they will have to speak?
Please answer in the chat box.
Okay.
So yes, Shrikant, OPQRST. Yes, Rabia, very good. So the first thing really, Shreya and Rabia, is history. Without history, you can't go anywhere. So you need to have history of the pain, history of the primary disease, whether it is cancer, whether it is pancreatitis, history of the treatment received, and other relevant history. Because we know, as in pain, in palliative care, we always see the cause could be disease related, it could be treatment related, it could be related to comorbidities, and it could be related to other reasons like debility. So you also need to know the whole detail, like Shrikant said, of the pain, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, and V of the pain. This is basic history taking in pain management. But the history is extremely important, but it gives you an idea of the diagnosis. It gives your mind the further decision making on what test you could conduct or what examination finding is relevant. So we are all aware from our days in first, second MBS that a patient with CA pancreas has relief in fetal position. So what are the palliating factors? What are the precipitating factors? What is the disease history? And that gives you a pointer towards the further diagnostic workup. So the history of the disease is extremely important. Like if somebody comes to you with a distended abdomen and you know he has CA stomach, it's very likely that the patient has a gastric outlet obstruction. If somebody comes to you with a CA ovary and liver metastasis and has pain, a diffuse pain in the abdomen, and the abdomen is distended, it's likely that he has ascites. Similarly, somebody with a colorectal carcinoma and distension, your mind should have warning bells to say that it's possibly a patient with malignant bowel obstruction. So the history of the disease is extremely important. You need to see whether the person has a condition which can rapidly deteriorate unless he has surgery. For example, if he has peritonitis. So he might look very, very sick. Most of the references from this session have been taken from UpToDate and from Oxford Textbook of Palliative Medicine. So UpToDate, in fact, says that the patient with peritonitis is so sick and has such exquisite tenderness that even if the examiner accidentally bumps the stretcher or bumps the trolley on which the patient is lying, the patient will wince and cry out in pain. So this exquisite tenderness, this abdominal rigidity and rebound tenderness, and the patient looks sick. So surgical abdomen is a patient in which unless you go for surgery soon, he can deteriorate rapidly. So we need to rule out in the first visit, in the examination finding itself, whether there is an emergency situation. So we went to the history of the pain, the history of the disease, history of the treatment, and you in the examination and in the history again, where is the pain? Because the anatomy, the sighting, the dermatomes will give you a pointer of the diagnosis. So like we all know, in upper abdominal pain, it could be acidity, it could be pancreatitis, it could also be angina. So we need to see which part of the body, which part of the abdomen is hurting. Again, in the right upper quadrant is likely to be liver, left upper quadrant is likely to be stomach or spleen. And again, in the upper quadrants, it could be pain which might confuse one. It could be pain related to a left lobar pneumonia, it could be an empyema. So we need to see what part of the abdomen is hurting and whether we can correlate that with the primary disease and the symptom. So like in the low quadrants, it could be an ovarian disease, it could be diverticulitis. In the rest of the abdomen, the diffuse abdominal pain, it could be colon. Anuja, am I speaking too fast?
No, ma'am. It's
Okay. Okay. So if we go into the commoner pains that present to a palliative care OPD, and you go into visceral pain, common causes are the neoplasms of the upper mid retroperitoneum, like the pancreas, or it could be the diffuse pain of an obstructed bowel, and commonly the sharp localized pain of the distension or the injury to an organ like liver or spleen. So usually associated with capsular pain, we are familiar with is the right upper quadrant pain of liver and the biliary tract. Might radiate to the back. And if you examine the patient, you might feel hepatomegally, you might see on the sonography there are hepatic mets. Sometimes even patients with viral hepatitis might have a right upper quadrant pain. So similarly, you can have an enlarged adrenal causing pain. You can have enlarged spleens, which can cause pain, which can cause a dragging sensation, and the patient is unable to sit, unable to bend if the spleen is extremely large, commonly seen in the hematopoietic and the lymphoproliferative disorders. So in the workup of every symptom, we went through the history of the symptom, the history of the primary disease. We also need to see whether any comorbidities which could contribute to the pain. So in somebody who has DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, or Addison's disease, you might have a diffuse abdominal pain with no specific localizing factors. Even hypercalcemia might present with diffuse abdominal pain. Again, related to therapy, if the patient has recently undergone an embolization of a liver lesion, he might have pain in the right upper quadrant. If he's had radiation to the bowel, radiation to the bladder or the prostate, it can cause radiation cystitis, prostatitis. The placement of a stent or the migration and perforation of a viscus because of a stent can cause pain. So you really need to see that the history is extremely important in finding out the etiology of the pain. Debility. Anybody? What is this cause of pain? That's right. So that is classically the herpes zoster lesion across the abdomen, and that could be a cause of abdominal pain. We need to see the patient. We need to examine the patient, take off his clothes, and examine the patient to see if there is a lesion. You cannot make a diagnosis based on the history alone. So another question. Tell me what this is. Does anybody have the answer? I can't see the chat, Anuja. Can you see the chat? So perforation peritonitis is the answer. That's very clearly under the diaphragm. So you can see the gas under the diaphragm. In fact, see gas between the loops of bowel, free gas between the loops of bowel, which is actually Wriggler's sign. So classically, this picture of gas under diaphragm, free gas in between the bowel loops, is a picture of perforation peritonitis. So if we go back to the pathophysiology of visceral pain, the understanding is very limited, and it's basic. The pain can be due to peripheral activation because of torsion, ischemia, inflammation, and distension. It could be because of peripheral sensitization and central sensitization. We are familiar with the term central sensitization in the context of neuropathic pain, but it also is a defined entity in visceral pain, and it could present with spontaneous pain or the perception of pain related to non-noxious stimuli. And typical syndromes of visceral pain which are related to central sensitization include esophageal non-cardiac chest pain and the pain of chronic pancreatitis, which is mediated through the NMDA receptors. So the descriptors in visceral pain are specific and typical. If it's a bowel which has injured or obstructed, it may be a vague pain, it may not be localized well, it may be cramping. But if it's the injury to a solid organ or to an organ capsule, it will be sharp and localized, may be described as a stabbing pain. Visceral pain is often accompanied by autonomous symptoms like nausea and vomiting, can have an emotional a component as well, can cause nausea. And burning pain has also been described in esophageal pain and bladder pain. So we are familiar with the common patterns of referred pain. We are aware from our undergraduate days of how liver pain is referred to the shoulder, diaphragmatic pain is referred to the scapula. We're familiar with these patterns. Upper abdominal pain can be referred from the stomach, pancreas, and liver. So it's important for us to remember these when you see the patient and when you examine the patient, because patients will present with that kind of referred pain. What is less familiar to us is that the referral sites can actually demonstrate hyperalgesia and allodynia. So you might miss a diagnosis. Sometimes the patient might present to you with allodynia in the lower abdomen, and that could actually be an indicator of injury to the pelvic organs. So in the area of referral, that dermatome might be exquisitely sensitive, it might be hyperalgesic, or there might be allodynia. So we're going on, with this basic background of abdominal pain, we need to now go on to the major part of the session, which is malignant bowel obstruction. We know the working definition is the presentation in which there is an obstruction to the transit of GI contents, either because of cancer or because of the consequences of therapy, which could include surgery, radiation, or chemotherapy. So spot diagnosis, what is the sign? Somebody tell me what the sign is. What is this? What is the radial, this X-ray? This X-ray is showing you a particular condition which is related to malignant bowel obstruction. What is this? Something more detailed than that, Bhanu. So this is a sigmoid volvulus, and the picture is classically is supposed to look like a coffee bean. So there is a twist in the sigmoid mesentery here, which is caused trapping of air and gas inside the dilated loop, and which looks kind of like a coffee bean. So this is the coffee bean sign, and all these X-rays have been taken from a very useful website which is called Radiology Masterclass, and which guides you on how to read plain X-rays. But these X-rays are very good quality X-rays, and may not really find this kind of X-rays in our clinical practice, but it's a good site to see and to revise our radiology. So how big is the problem, do you think, of malignant bowel obstruction? Do you think it's very common? It's an extremely common problem, and all of you who are seeing palliative care will see that CA ovary and CA of the colorectal malignancies present very, very commonly to our OPDs and are admitted for that reason. 15% of the admissions in a palliative care unit are because of malignant bowel obstruction. Apart from CA ovary and GI, they're also because of abdominal mets of bladder, melanoma, breast, and lung, which can cause an obstruction. And unfortunately, the life expectancy in an MBO is approximately 80 days, depending on whether that patient is amenable to chemotherapy after the presentation with MBO. So it's a very big problem, and it's a very big part, a big chunk of our OPDs and admissions. So what is the pathogenesis? We are aware that it could be because of disease within the lumen, disease in the wall of the bowel, disease outside, extrinsically compressing the lumen. It could also be involvement of the enteric nervous system or the celiac plexus, or also a paraneoplastic syndrome commonly seen in CA lung. So these could be the causes of the pathogenesis of malignant bowel obstruction. As usual, we also need to see whether there's anything else which contributes. Somebody who has an autonomic neuropathy because of diabetes, or somebody who's on opioids for severe pain, will have slowing of bowel, and that might compromise an already compromised lumen. Somebody who's on anticholinergics. Most of us have seen patients who had a severe constipation and have pain because of the constipation. And some well-meaning physician adds opioids to treat that pain and worsens the pain and worsens the constipation. So we need to see the history to see, is it a drug that we have written which is worsening the symptom? So in cancer, very often the compression of the lumen occurs slowly, and it often remains partial. The symptoms that the patient presents with really depends on where in the GI tract the obstruction is. So somebody who has an obstruction of the pylorus, might have an upper abdominal distension. He'll have profuse vomiting. He'll look very sick. He'll have anorexia and won't tolerate any meals. Somebody who has a partial obstruction of the lower colon may not have any vomiting till very late. He might present with obstipation. He cannot pass flatus, cannot pass motion, and he'll have distension. He in fact, might even tolerate a few sips of liquid diet. So depending on the anatomy of the obstruction, the patient's presentation will guide you to the diagnosis. So for example, in this X-ray, you can see that this is a small bowel obstruction. And you can see the bowel is so distended that you can see the valvulae conniventis. Most of the symptoms of the obstruction are because of the accumulation of large quantities of fluid within the bowel, causing distension, causing pain, causing nausea and vomiting. So we're all familiar with this. I'm going through this very fast. We know that there is stasis of the gut contents, which causes epithelial damage. This will lead to further inflammation, release of VIP, secretagogues, prostaglandins, increased secretions in the pancreas, in the intestine and the bile, more and more influx of sodium, more distension, more pain, because of the increase in the edema, there might be less reabsorption of water and electrolytes, entering into a vicious cycle, causing intestinal hyperemia, edema and distension, and this will finally lead to abdominal cramping. Sometimes the bowel tries to push the contents further, and then the patient can come to you with severe colic, cramping, nausea, vomiting. So this is the pathogenesis of bowel obstruction, which we're all familiar with. So if you go to a case history, I have this lady who is 58 years old. She has advanced CA colon, has had multiple lines of chemo after her initial surgery. Her PPS is 40. She has obstipation. She has pedal edema and can tolerate liquid diet. On the other hand, I have a lady called Sheila who's 48 years old. She is CA ovary. She has been treated aggressively with multiple lines of chemotherapy after her cytoreduction. She has large volume vomits. She has ascites and constipation and continuous abdominal pain. She has severe anorexia. What do you think, which patient has which kind of obstruction? What do you think? What do you think Padma has? Do you think from the pattern of the symptoms, do you think it's a large bowel or a small bowel disease? And from the pattern of Shaila's symptoms, do you think it's a partial obstruction or a complete obstruction? Do you think it is upper GI or lower GI? The symptom and the examination should give you a clue. So Rabia's large bowel for Padma, and the first case, Shaila has small bowel. Yes, Bhanu, Shaila has small bowel. So this is you really need to see from the picture and the symptom of which part of the bowel is affected, because that will guide your management. So what the workup really depends on your setup, on the availability of investigations, on the cost of investigations. So an X-ray can be done, but like we said, X-rays are not very sensitive, and you can, in 10 to 20% patients, you might actually miss findings. As high as 30% patients, you might have no findings. So the gold standard, this is an X-ray of a patient with in the supine and erect view. So in the supine view, you can see there is a distension of bowel. And when the patient is made to sit up, there are clear-cut multiple fluid levels which are guiding you towards a diagnosis of bowel obstruction. So X-rays are important and available in most places, but they're often not enough. The gold standard, of course, is CT scan, which has a higher accuracy, a higher sensitivity. And we can also give you a guide on the extent of disease, on the stage of disease, and will therefore help you take a decision on whether the patient can go for surgery, whether the patient is amenable to stenting, or whether the patient will end up with medical management, which is our forte. So we really need to see at this stage, after you've seen the patient, you've taken the history, you examined the patient, you've got the basic workup done, is the patient a candidate for surgery? Do you think this patient can undergo a self-expanding metallic stent? Or do you think this patient needs a Ryle's tube to vent the distended stomach or the distended small bowel? So these questions must come to your mind after you've come to a definitive diagnosis. So the best chance you can offer a patient is if you can surgically treat the cause of obstruction. There are several options. There could be a bypass, there could be debulking of tumor. You might end up with a colostomy or an ileostomy in a higher up obstruction, or there could be adhesiolysis. But the important thing we need to see is the patient a candidate for surgery from the point of view of her patient factors? Is she fit? Is she very sick? Is she towards the end of life? Is she agreeing for surgery? And when you look at the surgery factors, if there are diffuse intraabdominal masses, she's likely to be a poor candidate for surgery. If there is carcinomatosis, if there are multiple palpable masses, if there's gross ascites, in gross ascites, there is as high a risk of 41% perioperative mortality in one series. So a large ascites is a contraindication for surgery. If there are multiple surgeries in the past, which might make the task of the surgeon extremely difficult, that could be a contraindication for surgery. So you need to see whether the patient is a candidate for surgery. So in some of the studies which have studied the outcomes after surgery in gynae cancers, there was a study by Chai and Ripamonti in which they saw that there was symptomatic improvement in 100% patients, which persisted for around 3 months. But there was a 30-day mortality of as high as 10 to 40%. There were also a high complication rate of fistula, dehiscence, infections, bleeding, and thrombosis in 9 to 90% patients. And the authors felt that there was a low likelihood of benefit if the patient had diffuse carcinomatosis, if there was large volume ascites, and palpable intra-abdominal masses. So like I said, large volume ascites can predict a mortality of as high as 41%. So we need to see our patients and see whether they are likely to undergo surgery successfully. The entity of carcinomatosis is a distinct entity and is a poor risk factor for surgery because usually the obstruction at multiple levels and because of infiltration as well as infiltration of the nervous system. So the bowel obstruction is not straightforward. And it's usually a slow process, it's partial, it's intermittent, it does not cause strangulation. Using a Ryle's tube might intermittently give relief. And in general, the surgical outcomes are poor. There's a high 30-day operative mortality. There are frequent complications, and even after surgery, the patient is likely to re-obstruct. So carcinomatosis again is a poor option. The patient is a poor option, poor choice for surgery. If we're talking about surgical outcome in colorectal carcinoma, there was a retrospective review of 47 patients treated with surgery at a single center. The median survival was 3.5 months, and 80% could actually continue to take oral diet. They found 3 distinct groups. 15% died in the 30 days of surgery in the first month. 51% survived 2.6 months, and 34% were good candidates for chemotherapy and survived an average of 10.3 months. So it's very important to individualize therapy. Like everything in palliative care, each person behaves differently. So you cannot have one size fits all. You need to see that particular patient and see what his best options are. The negative prognostic factor in colorectal cancer undergoing surgery was a high age and a very short time interval between the primary surgery and the malignant bowel obstruction. So that could give you a hint on which patients will do badly after surgery. Are you guys awake? Anuja?
Yes, ma'am.
Is everyone awake? How do we know? We'll ask a question.
Yeah, when you ask questions, you'll know.
Okay.
Ask question.
Okay. So do you think a stent is an option? Which patients are a good candidate for stents? Which kind of stents are available? How expensive are they? Thank you, Jayata. So the stents we really are available in specific patients, not for all patients. They are self-expanding metallic stents for esophageal, gastric outlet, duodenal, and large bowel obstructions. The issue in most parts of our country are the availability of the stent, the cost of the stent, and the skilled gastroenterologists who can place those stents. But where they're available, they're a boon because it's a OPD procedure. It's not so painful, and it can be a bridge, and in fact can be a substitute to surgery. There was a review in 2007 on stenting for large bowel obstruction, and they found that technical success was achieved in 96% patients, clinical success in 92%, and the early complications were migration, perforation, and reobstruction, and late complications were again perforation, reobstruction, and tenesmus. So stenting is a viable option in a small select group of patients. Stenting is also recommended if there is a more distal obstruction, if there's a shorter length of obstruction, and it has a better success in primary colorectal carcinoma rather than extrinsic obstruction. So we discussed in the options after seeing the patient whether surgery was an option. We discussed if stenting is an option. And the third option, if surgery and stenting is not possible, is optimal medical management. Okay, one thing we really must talk about is that obstruction in our undergraduate years, we thought was always an emergency where the decision has to be taken very soon. But we see in cancer that the patient gives you time. You rarely have an emergency situation. You can discuss with the patient, the oncologist, the gastroenterologist, and the family of the possible outcomes and see what is the best path, what gives the best quality of life and best symptom control to the patient and the family. So it's rarely an emergency. So the step 3 in medical management is extremely important for us, for patients like Padma and Sheila. So if you, so the one take home from a session on malignant bowel obstruction is to understand if your patient's obstruction is partial or if it's complete and refractory. If it's partial, our goal is to normalize gut function. So if you think that like our patient like Padma, if you think her bowel obstruction is partial, we would like to normalize gut function. But if our patient is like Sheila, where the obstruction is likely to be refractory or complete, our goal is to rest the bowel. Once you understand what our goal is, your management is comparatively simple. So if we talk about partial obstruction, patient has come to you with some nausea and vomiting, unable to tolerate feeds, you would decide to keep her nil by mouth. You might give her IV fluids if you think she's thirsty and dehydrated. You would, very, very important to give analgesia according to the WHO step ladder. Now, the bone of contention is the nasogastric tube. So do you need a nasogastric tube? Yes, very often in the initial phase to decompress the bowel, to help decrease the nausea and vomiting, to decrease the distension. But as your medical management progresses, it's possible that in many patients, you will be able to remove the nasogastric tube. Nasogastric tubes are an irritant, they hurt, then can cause erosion. And if the patient if you can control the nausea and vomiting and distension without the nasogastric tube, that is where we're trying to head with our maximal medical management. So in partial obstruction, we said we keep her NBM, we decide about the Ryle's tube, we definitely start analgesia as first priority, and then we decide on which antiemetic to give the patient. So this patient has nausea, she does not have colic. Only because she does not have colic and we think it's a partial obstruction, we will try to give her prokinetics. We will give her metoclopramide. The regular doses of metoclopramide that we are using are 10 milligram to TDS to QID. Now in obstruction in palliative care, we change that dose to as high as 60 to 120 milligram. The rider is, the warning is that we must see that the patient does not have colicky pain. We must also watch the patient and tell your nursing staff that in case the patient develops colic after the Reglan, we must stop. We must keep a close watch on the patient because in these high doses of metoclopramide and an obstructed bowel, you can rarely encounter a perforation, and you can also see extraperitoneal symptoms in these high doses of metoclopramide. So we said our goal here was to restore or normalize bowel function. So very often, metoclopramide along with steroid can help actually normalize bowel function, and the patient might be able to actually swallow liquids and start taking a diet. In this setting, very often you might need to use more than one antiemetic, which could be ondansetron or that family, and haloperidol. There is a lot of literature on the use of somatostatin analogs like octreotide and lanreotide. The evidence is not robust. There is conflicting evidence. There are some articles in which they have proved that the nasogastric drainage can decrease from as high as 1680 ml to less than 50 ml per day. So that can make a huge difference in the abdominal distension, in the Ryle's tube output, in the vomiting, and in the symptom control. But there are many studies in which they found that octreotide did not give any relief, did not decrease the number of nausea and the number of vomiting episodes. And in fact, in some studies, increase the need for Buscopan. So I think the patient who really might do well on octreotide are patients who have a significant secretory component to the obstruction. So somebody who has a very large a nasogastric output like 3 liters, like 2.8 liters, they are patients who are likely to do well with octreotide. Somebody who already has a small output, has an RT aspirate of say 300 ml or 250 ml, may not do so well on octreotide. And octreotide is extremely expensive. So we can also use glycopyrrolate and buscopan with good effect to decrease the secretions. And of course, there are several studies on steroids which showed a trend towards resolution, but the numbers needed to treat was 6. And the anti-emetic and anti-inflammatory effect can decrease the tumor swelling, and in some patients can relieve the obstruction. But there are significant side effects, so we need to give a time-limited trial, maybe 3 days or 4 days, to see if the steroid is helping, and then we have to gradually stop them. So in the medical management, we need to see, give the patient NBM, analgesia, antiemetics, octreotide if required, anticholinergics, and steroids. And the goal here is to restore bowel function and get the Ryle's tube out. So this will help the patient have less symptoms, have the patient better quality of life, and in a significant proportion of patients, you can start clear fluids. So this was the management of partial obstruction. So this was Padma. She had advanced colon cancer. She had a large colon obstruction. And because she was not a candidate for surgery, we optimized the medical management. We were able to remove the Ryle's tube, and she was able to increase her intake. She was able to swallow liquids, and most of those liquids are absorbed in the huge absorptive surface of the colon and the jejunum. So in a partial obstruction, you can normalize gut function. The more difficult picture is in complete obstruction. So now we discuss partial obstruction. Now we're going to complete obstruction. So in this patient, especially in somebody who has a upper GI obstruction, they might have copious vomiting. So definitely that patient is NBM. You need to give IV fluids. You will need a Ryle's tube to vent the stomach. So we know that the stomach and the upper bowel can secrete approximately 3 to 4 liters in the course of a normal day. So if the stomach is obstructed, or the duodenum or ileum is obstructed, that whole volume stays in the stomach and the small bowel, causing severe discomfort. So the Ryle's tube can work to vent that, to decrease that distension. Again, analgesia, antiemetics, anticholinergics, and octreotide as required by the patient. But here you remember, we do not use prokinetics. Here we understand that the bowel is not functioning, that we are not in a position to make the bowel work. So we will not give prokinetics. We will depend on ondansetron and the family, and we can use haloperidol. So Sheila, the second candidate, had a small bowel obstruction, which was complete. And we did need an NGT to vent the stomach secretions. We did not give a prokinetic. Her symptoms resolved on ondansetron, haloperidol, and Ryle's tube aspirate. Here, the situation is that you need to have an option to give her fluids, maybe subcutaneously, maybe intravenous, and to give medication, because the oral route is not reliable. So here, in complete obstruction, the goal is to rest the bowel. Okay, now, what is this? So this is a bowel obstruction, and it is actually a small bowel obstruction, but because this significant distension, you can be confused. If you see it carefully, you can see the valvulae conniventis. This is a small bowel obstruction. And this is the supine view, and this is the erect view. Is there a specific role of ranitidine? What is the role of more and more in the case files, we are seeing the use of PPIs, of pantoprazole and omeprazole. You occasionally see a prescription of Rantac today. Is Rantac superior to pantoprazole, or do we not have data? Yes, Neetu. It is an anti-secretory, and Mayank, it is more effective than PPIs, in fact. In a study on, because we've been emphasizing and re-emphasizing that decreasing GI secretions is a goal of MBO. So decreasing the distension, decreasing the pain, decreasing the nausea and the vomiting. And in a study on the effect of PPIs and Rantac on decreasing GI secretion by Clark and Caro, they found that the volume of gastric fluid was more significantly decreased by Rantac rather than proton pump inhibitors. So Rantac in a dose of 50 milligram TDS to QID may be more effective in decreasing the volume of secretions than PPIs. So the role of TPN in very few patients will actually benefit from TPN, and the routine use is to be avoided. It's expensive, it's inconvenient, there's a significant increase in the burden to the patient and the family. Survival benefits only in very few patients and in few indications where they might be being optimized for surgery or optimized for chemotherapy. So as a rule, its routine use is not recommended. Long-term outcomes depend really on the site of the obstruction. Better outcomes in large bowel, wherein 80% patients can be relieved. Poor outcome in small bowel and mixed bowel. Again, if it's a single site of obstruction, it's more likely that we are able to achieve a favorable long-term outcome. In this, this is a small study by Chakrabarti et al. They studied 35 patients who had bowel obstruction, and they found that 17% had, 26 of those 35 patients went home, and 6 patients died in the first 30 days, and 3 patients were shifted to palliative care and end-of-life care. So prognosis in general in bowel obstruction is poor. Predictors of survival, as in most things in palliative care, is the performance status, the ECOG performance status. And in the median survival of ECOG 0 to 1 can be 200 days plus, ECOG 2 can be 2 months, and ECOG 3 and 4 is less than 1 month. But having said that, most of the all the studies in bowel obstruction are not in the setting of a controlled trial. They're all observational studies. And if somebody walks into your OPD or to your hospital with a good performance status, he's likely to be offered more aggressive treatment. So the performance status is the driver of the treatment and also the predictor of the poor prognosis. Other predictors, like we said, also are huge ascites, heavy tumor burden, aggressive disease, low albumin, and extensive aggressive previous treatment. These are predictors of poor survival in MBO. So we've completed the first 2 parts of our topic, that was abdominal pain and malignant bowel obstruction. Now going on to the related topic, somebody who comes to you with ascites. Ascites also has a poor prognosis, a median survival of 1 to 4 months, depending on whether there is further treatment options available. So for example, in CA ovary, the patients are often very sensitive to cytotoxic chemotherapy, and they could have a higher survival. So, common cause, if you see 100 patients of ascites, 75% of them probably have cirrhosis, 10% malignancy, and a small percentage cardiac failure and tuberculosis. So the main questions that come to us in ascites is what is the role of diuretics? Is there any specific technique or specific recommendation for paracentesis, and the role of intravenous fluids, if any? So again now, picture. This is a trick question. What is this an X-ray of? In this condition, usually one doesn't do an X-ray. This is a hint. Somebody tell me what this X-ray is. Yes, Dr. Anju, this is ascites. One usually does an USG for ascites, but in case you have you do an X-ray, this is what ascites will look like. This is fluid. This is all fluid, and the bowel is floating in the middle of all that fluid. So in malignant ascites is commonly seen in ovarian cancer, less frequently with endometrium, breast, colon, gastric, and pancreas, and occasionally in the setting of an unknown primary. Symptoms related are because of distension, you can have an esophageal reflux, you can have nausea, vomiting, stretching sensation, less mobility, negative body image, discomfort, inability to sleep, dyspnea, lymphedema, pain in the groin, pain in the subcostal region. And there's also been a case report of abdominal compartment syndrome because of the huge ascites. So we really, in ascites, we need to understand the two basic pathophysiologies in ascites. One is the picture, which is like cirrhosis, which can also be seen in somebody who has large hepatic mets or multiple hepatic mets, where the cause of the ascites is really a picture like portal hypertension, splanchnic vasodilatation, which causes sodium and fluid retention. So in this patient, the ascitic fluid is like that in cirrhosis and has the properties of a transudate. On the other hand, the commoner picture in malignant ascites is because of tumor invasion. And that is because of the invasion of the parietal peritoneum, the visceral peritoneum. The tumor neovasculature is extremely leaky. And this ascites will have a relatively high protein concentration, and is because of increased permeability. So both are different mechanisms, and we need to see our patient has predominantly which cause of ascites, because the treatment will be different. So in somebody who has a higher serum albumin ascitic fluid gradient, so it is more than 1.1, then it's likely to have a picture similar to cirrhosis. These patients are likely to respond to diuretics and an aldosterone antagonist in combination with a loop diuretic. So if your patient has a picture which is similar to cirrhosis, if he has a large liver, multiple liver mets, or a single large met, and the, the serum albumin ascitic fluid albumin gradient is 1.1 grams or more, it's likely that he will respond to diuretics. But on the other hand, if you have somebody who doesn't have that picture, he might respond better to ascites tapping and paracentesis. This decision has to be taken very carefully because many patients are blindly started on diuretics, and you end up causing dyselectrolytemia, dehydration, fatigue, and it does not help the original complaint. So we need to understand what is the mechanism behind the ascites before treating it. Paracentesis gives immediate relief, good relief, but Cochrane review in 2010 was not able to identify any particular method of ascites of tapping, was not able to underline the specific duration of keeping an indwelling catheter, and did not answer the question of whether intravenous fluids were required or recommended. Up to date says that in non-ovarian causes of peritoneal carcinomatosis with malignant C-related ascites, large volume therapeutic paracentesis is recommended rather than diuretics, and recommends against the use of any colloids in this setting. So intravenous fluids we really do not recommend unless the patient is very hypertensive, dehydrated, or has significant renal impairment. And in the picture of malignant ascites, the non-cirrhotic kind of picture, we rarely see any complications, and large volume paracentesis has been done without the need for fluid. And this has been, I think, everyone's experience, and I think the seniors can also share this. In somebody who has pedal edema, when you tap ascites slowly, the gradual absorption of the fluid into the system takes care of the loss of volume. Somebody who has no edema, somebody who has a cirrhotic kind of picture but is not responding to diuretics, that patient in the setting of large volume paracentesis may need fluids for hypertension. So only a very small proportion of patients will need fluids. So how much to tap? We've always been advocating large volume paracentesis, and because to decrease the number of visits to the hospital, to decrease the burden on the patient, and to give symptom relief for as long as possible. But there has been a study by McNamara et al. In which they found that they tapped patients for over 24 hours, and they tapped 5.3 liters ascites, and the symptom relief was maximum in the first 2 hours. And after the first few hours, when the first few liters were tapped, after that there was no significant symptom relief. So in a very frail patient or a very sick patient, even tapping 1 to 2 liters could be enough. But you need to see that pragmatically in the back setting of patient visits, how far the patient stays, how often can he come. And that is the reason why people have also placed indwelling pigtail catheters and more sophisticated catheters so that patients can tap fluid at home and they're not dependent on the hospital facility or traveling to a hospital for tapping ascites. So to summarize the class, when you're dealing with a patient who comes to your OPD with abdominal pain, history is the most important. The history is the most important, and of course, examination. When you're dealing with malignant bowel obstruction, in partial obstruction, our goal of care is to normalize the gut function. And in a complete obstruction or a refractory obstruction, the patient's symptom control and quality of life is best preserved by resting the bowel. When you're treating ascites, we need to find out what is the pathophysiology behind the ascites, and only then we should start treatment. So somebody who has a picture like cirrhosis or portal hypertension should be given a trial of diuretics. And somebody who does not have that picture, who has a peritoneal picture, who has a malignancy which does not have liver mets, will not do well with diuretics and will need to be planned for repeated paracentesis. So that's it for me.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, and it was really comprehensive. We have a few questions from chat.
Yeah.
So the first question is about partial bowel obstruction. So what is the role of enema in obstruction?
So I think in partial obstruction, we are using, like we said, we use prokinetics, and we will use in enema, we might even use Dulcoflex to help the bowel move. But in somebody who's a complete obstruction, it will not serve any purpose, and there we will not use it. Sometimes patients with a complete obstruction will complain to you, in fact, of diarrhea because of the retained products and because of bacterial degeneration. There is no role of using stimulant laxative or a prokinetic in somebody with a complete obstruction. But when in the process of diagnosing or in the process of understanding the situation, we do use prokinetics. But once you understood that this is established obstruction, we would not use stimulant because that could cause a perforation.
Okay, so I think that answers. Similar question is related to intussusception. So use of Dulcolax per rectal, how does it really help?
So we said if it is a obstruction which is not well established, and if it is in the process, you're in the process of diagnosing it, and there are no severe colicky signs, we could use a stimulant under cover of steroid. And it's keeping a strict watch on the patient's clinical signs and symptoms. Like we said, if somebody has a worsening colic or severe pain after a prokinetic, we would stop the prokinetic and stop the stimulants.
Yeah. So, ma'am, we have another question related to MBO. So role of, so when we consider hydration, first is about keeping patient NBM. So can we give fluids in controlled manner, or should we keep them NPM completely?
So it's extremely important to keep the patient hydrated, and many patients can have sips of fluid and without any symptom. So if, like Dr. Rajeshri has mentioned, that we can give sips of fluid and sips of water, if the patient is able to tolerate that, that would be the best option. If patients are vomiting so profusely and have significant discomfort, then we would request them to have less fluid. And if you notice in clinical practice, very often when you put the Ryle's tube, even for venting, even in an established obstruction where the patient is not able to feed, the patient very often, for his own satisfaction, will have a few sips of tea, a few sips of clear fluid, and that comes back in the Ryle's tube, but he's still satisfied. So that is all on a case-to-case basis. We would encourage oral fluids as long as the patient can tolerate it, as long as the patient does not worsen the symptom. Even definitely in partial obstruction, our goal is to start oral fluids. And in complete obstruction, after a Ryle's tube, many patients can have small quantities of liquids which comes back in the Ryle's tube but gives them satisfaction of having swallowed something. And in hospitals where venting gastrostomies are being done, they're also giving oral fluids, and that comes out in the gastrostomy, but the patient has satisfaction.
Yeah. So I think, ma'am, there are a lot of questions coming up for obstruction, like what is the role of ondansetron?
So ondansetron, see, the first thing that occurs to us is ondansetron causes constipation. How can you write it? So we need to understand in bowel obstruction, there is a lot of 5-HT3 in the bowel. And if your prokinetics are not working and the patient has significant symptom burden, we can add ondansetron even in partial obstruction. In complete obstruction, able to make the bowel move. So whether your drug is causing more constipation is a material that patient is totally obstructed. In partial obstruction, our first dose of choice would be prokinetic, haloperidol with steroid, with or without ondansetron. In complete obstruction, it's ondansetron without any prokinetics. Is that clear, Anuja? Am I being talking too much?
No, ma'am.
Is that clear?
It is clear. So another question about obstruction is there any role of palliative radiotherapy in single site bowel obstruction?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge.
All right. So yeah, and now we move on to ascites. There are some other questions related to hydration, but we can come back to that later. But moving on to ascites, there are certain questions like what is the role of IV albumin in ascitic tapping?
So there is we don't recommend the use of IV albumin for tapping of ascites in malignancy, definitely. It's too expensive and there is no proven benefit of the use of albumin. There is in fact a recommendation of the to see against the use of albumin in malignant ascites. Yes, there has been literature in the use of albumin for large volume paracentesis in patients of advanced cirrhosis. So in a small population of cirrhotics who have refractory ascites, in whom diuretics are not working, in those patients, when you're doing a large volume paracentesis like 5 to 6 liters in one admission, there is a recommendation for the use of albumin. But most of our patients that we are handling in palliative care, there is no recommendation for albumin.
Yes. I think there were certain papers that you said were like more than 5 liters of ascitic tapping. So in those cases, maybe giving albumin does really help.
So even in when the old Oxford, the last edition, they recommended a slow tap. So they said that if the patient has pedal edema and you tap it slowly, or maybe you admit the patient and tap small quantities on the day of admission and then another small quantity the next morning, gradually the edema fluid gets resorbed and you do not need even IV fluids. So very strong recommendation against the use of albumin for malignant ascites. Even in large volume paracentesis, you could tap it slowly, but you need not give albumin.
Yeah, I agree, ma'am. Ma'am, role of indwelling catheters. So how frequently do we perform putting indwelling catheters for ascites management?
So the Cochrane review was not able to give any answers on which catheter, because there is a description of use of pigtail catheters and the high-tech Plurex catheters and the Tenkov catheters. We have been using a pigtail catheter. The rider is that somebody who's coming to you frequently for a tap, if they coming to you every 6 or 7 days, and that's many of our families are daily paid laborers, or they may not be, or if they're not daily paid also, it means loss of a day's work for the family. So, and if they are sensible enough to be able to open the stopcock and drain 500 ml every alternate day, we are putting pigtail catheters in ascites which needs frequent tapping. There is a risk of infection. There is a risk of the catheter. The pigtail catheter has 5 holes, so it should not get blocked easily, but does get blocked with fibrin clots. There is a risk of infection. There's a risk of leak around the catheter, and a blocked catheter as well. You need to really be careful of patient selection. Because some patients can really manage very well, and then they can decrease the frequency of visits to us once in 45 days and once in a month.
Okay. So, ma'am, we have a question from a postgraduate who is asking about criteria for abdominal compartment syndrome.
Oh dear. So the abdominal compartment syndrome is when your the abdominal pressure is really so high that I don't have the definition in terms of millimeters of mercury, but it's the pressure in the abdomen is so high that your vital organ perfusion is affected. You can have multi-organ failure. So usually patient, it's a critical care kind of scenario, and in the critical care setup, we're actually measuring intra-abdominal pressure, and the patient might end up with surgery to decrease intra-abdominal pressure. So ascites can cause such a compartment syndrome, which can affect the perfusion of vital organs and lead to multi-organ failure. So there is one case report on that situation.
Yeah. So, ma'am, there are certain questions on hydration. So, hydration related issues. What is the role of subcutaneous hydration and bowel obstruction?
So the subcutaneous route is an underutilized route and can be used with great advantage. If the patient is in the hospital, most wards will already have an intravenous line. So I would not say take out the IV line and put a subcut line. If it's a functioning IV line is there, definitely it's effective, it's efficient. But somebody who wants to go home, and we've had patients who are staying at home with subcut lines, in which the patient's daughter was able to take the subcut line, was giving 100 ml fluid, then bathing her mother, then taking her mother out on the balcony, bringing her back inside, giving another 100 ml of fluid. So it gives the patient and family a lot of flexibility and less pain. But somebody whom you think you are needing to give, who has a good general condition, who you think might survive for 4 months odd, or who might have, who's very thirsty, who has a good PS, subcut fluid you cannot give very fast. You cannot give very large volumes. So it is a context dependent decision. If somebody needs large fluids, has a good general condition, is likely to have a longer survival, maybe subcut is not enough. But somebody who has whose family is equipped and comfortable with managing subacute fluids, and there is difficult venous access, subacute is a good option.
Yeah. And ma'am, there are questions about dose of Buscopan. So what would be the maximum dose of recommended dose of Buscopan?
So Buscopan has been used as high as 120 milligram in 24 hours. It's been used as a continuous subcutaneous infusion. It has been used as boluses. You could begin 20 milligram TDS and go up depending on the
So ma'am, a maximum recommended would be how high in Buscopan?
We're using 120 milligram in 24 hours.
All right. All right. So yeah, I think we've covered most of the questions. There was a question on NST. So is there a role of NST? So putting NST and how advisable it is, and when do we put NST? This is from Sonali Kulkarni.
What is an NST? Sorry.
Yeah, Sonali, can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, nasogastric tube, ma'am.
It's a gastric tube.
Yeah.
NGT. So NGT we need to put if there is a significant element of vomiting, or if you think the upper bowel is distended. So we put the Ryle's tubes to decompress the stomach, decompress the upper intestine. And once the symptoms improve, and once you're able to decrease the secretory component by using Rantac and Buscopan, then you're very often able to remove the Ryle's tube. So definitely there's a role in the early management, but like this, most surgeons feel every obstruction has to have a Ryle's tube till death. That's not true.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I think, ma'am, we can stop here because we have already crossed our time.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you for resolving all the queries we have had. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjum. I was worried that Anjum, the way Anjum talks so fast, I will ask people that afterwards, after the lecture, that whether but it was so good and you were very clear, and it was a big topic, and I was worried that whether we will get time for discussion, but I think all discussion has happened. Anuja has taken care of all the questions which were there in the chat box. Even if you have any other questions and if you want to ask anything from Anjum, because Anjum has really read well the topic from wherever possible in the world, and she has brought almost everything which is required to know in malignant bowel obstruction. Thank you very much, Anjum, and have a